Hola, gracias por estar aquí. Mi nombre es Dave Lewis, and that's about as much as I ever learned from Dora the Explorer. It is really a lovely treat to be back here in Bogota, and thanks to Ed, thanks to Tactile Edge, and especially thanks to all of you for being here and making this such a wonderful event. I really do appreciate the opportunity. The one thing that Ed really didn't realize that he could just leverage in order to get me here was mentioning café con leche, and I will be on the next plane. So, let me just take a moment to introduce myself. I have been doing security for the better part of 25 years, and along the road, I have done all sorts of different activities. I have done everything from being a firewall admin right through to being a CISO for an organization, and I have lots of scar tissue to prove it. If you've ever seen my talk before, you've heard me say that before, and it still hangs true today. It has been a really interesting journey because along the way, I have learned all sorts of lessons, and all these lessons I recorded in notebooks as I went along. I had a mentor early on in my early days. Before I ever got into this field, I worked for a record company, and he said, always carry a notebook with you. I didn't realize the gravity of that statement at the time until much, much later, years later, actually, when I went back to look at all these stories and all these lessons learned and all these mistakes I made, and I thought, okay, I can share these as lessons with other people, giving talks, writing for articles in Forbes and other publications like that. Being able to share these events with obviously removing the names of the guilty, which was usually me. So I identify myself as a hacker, boo. And the world sees hackers in a very negative way. Here it says, hackers must die, hackers must be stopped, and all hackers must die. So laboring under that sort of view of people that people have of you in the world, it really does take a toll on you. But I do take a little bit of solace in that I am Canadian. And it's really interesting, whenever I travel the world, there's like, oh no, you're the other Americans. I was like, no. We love our brothers, but lately it's been rather problematic. But it's not always quite what you imagine. So for example, about 2 years ago, I was in the lobby of a hotel in New Delhi, and I was getting ready to check out to go on to my next city. I was going on to Goa. And I was standing there checking out, and this woman comes up to me, very nicely dressed, and she looks at me and she goes, "Excuse me, sir, are you an American?" I said, "Well, no, actually, I'm from Canada." She said, "Good." I've never been so scared in all my life. So as a result of that, and seeing as how I'm into multi-factor authentication and zero trust, I actually got a tattoo of a Canadian maple leaf on my right arm because I figured a patch on the backpack wouldn't quite sell it as much as a tattoo. Now, if you ever want to find a Canadian in their natural habitat, we're usually dressed up as a homicidal maniac and running across a sheet of ice with pieces of metal stuck to our feet. I work for Duo Security, and recently we were actually acquired by Cisco. So now we identify as Cisco, or Duo Security, a division of Cisco. And it's really amazing how quickly things have happened. We have transitioned from being the Zero Trust company to being Zero Trust Plus Plus, in that we are now on the Cisco website, and that's about the extent of it. I was going to go there. But the really interesting thing with all of this transition is we missed a golden marketing opportunity. We had Duo, we had Cisco, and we really did miss the opportunity to call it Disco. And I have to thank my boss, Wendy Nather, for that one. Full props. And it's been very entertaining in that when you go through an acquisition, you worry about all sorts of things. Am I going to have a job tomorrow? And things to that effect. And being part of Cisco has been amazing so far. So I want to say kudos to my fellow Cisco family. We're still trying to figure out how to actually say that properly because we're still used to calling ourselves Duo Nuts. But our mission is to protect your mission. It's really that simple. It's about democratizing security. I heard that the other day with, I believe it was Chad Loader's talk, where he actually talked about democratizing security, and that's just it. We need to make security far more approachable and easier for people to use so they will adopt it. Show of hands, how many people in here have ever used PGP? How many of you were happy about the experience? Yeah, that's what I thought. It can be so much better. And when we talk about zero trust, it's like, what are we talking about? We're talking about where the decisions are being made, where the trust decisions are being made. You must continually verify. Now, we've heard about, don't trust but verify, but with zero trust, you want to make sure you're verifying everybody. You want to assume everything is hostile. It's that simple. And you want to make sure that you're talking about, it's not a rip and replace kind of conversation. You have most of the elements of a zero trust framework in your enterprise today. When I go back to the start of my career 25 odd years ago, we were talking about network zone segmentation. We were talking about authorization and authentication and all the rest of it. We were talking about all these different pieces that today now have the wonderful wrapper where we call it zero trust. We've been doing it all along, it's just we haven't brought all these pieces together, and we haven't learned the lessons that we should have been learning as we went forward. But the really interesting thing, when you mention zero trust to anybody in pretty much every country that I go to in my travels, I'll actually be in Lithuania in a couple days, is they always have a different experience. If you ask a room of 100 different people, what is love? They're going to give you 100 different answers. And these days, because so many different vendors out there have their own version of what zero trust is, it has really gotten to that point where nobody's really sure. So the way I like to position it is that zero trust is an ideal to aspire to. Because the reality is that everything is on fire. Everything is hostile. There's always that mentality of, it worked in dev, it should work just fine. Now, as a security practitioner, how many people have felt like this every single day of their lives? Now, zero trust is really something that came out of what was called the Jericho Forum back in 2007, and this was when they put out a paper talking about deperimeterization. It's a mouthful. Let me try that again. Deperimeterization. Close enough. And the really funny thing is organizations that I worked at, previous to that, we were trying to do something like that, but we never really articulated it as deperimeterization, zero trust, or what have you. It was just we had that idea of this is a good thing to do. Then later on, John Kinderberg, who was somebody I absolutely love driving crazy, he came up with the term zero trust in 2010. And you know what? Kudos to him for doing that. Because by doing so, he gave us a marketing term that we can associate with, something that we can relate to, something that we can internalize and make it more of something that we understand. Because prior to this, we had all the elements, we just weren't doing it in a very good way. Now, if you want to learn a much more in-depth conversation about zero trust, there is this book. I don't actually know the authors myself, but this is actually a really good resource if you want to find that and read about it. This is called Zero Trust Networks. Now, the IT landscape has obviously changed. We have cloud, we have mobile, we have anywhere. I remember working in organizations where it's like, nope, you can only access your computer at work and you could only do it during the hours between 9 and 5. That has melted away in the modern business environment. So we have to look at different ways to do things. And zero trust, the whole idea here is you want to enable access to multiple cloud environments. You want to enable BYOD. Remember when that came out about 4 or 5 years ago? Everybody was like, oh, it's the next evil or it's the next great thing. You can do it now. There is actually ways to do it. And most of all, you want to make data breaches far less probable. You won't get rid of it entirely, but you're actually going to make things a lot better. Now, Google has their own version of it they call BeyondCorp. This is their own implementation of zero trust. And if you ever get a chance to read their BeyondCorp paper, I highly recommend it. This is actually a really good resource. And this is the timeline that they went through. Back in 2014, they proposed this. Right through to 2017, they actually came out with a report on how they were doing, which is amazing because these days, not too many companies are transparent with what they're doing. Now, this is the traditional approach that I was talking about. You know, you had to be at your desk, we had the firewall, we had the moat, we had the castle walls. This is the way things always were. Now, with the zero trust model, if you'll forgive the Duo logo, access decisions are being made all over the place. At one point in time, I used to refer to data as being the perimeter, but the reality is where the access decisions are being made. Now, we all love triangles. We had the CIA triad that was mentioned earlier, and of course, I didn't check my text was going to wrap or not, but you were looking at apps, devices, and users are the three main components when you're looking at it from a zero trust perspective. So, how do we get there? Starting off, you want to confirm user identities, but you know what? Even below that, you want to have an asset inventory. So here's a quick show of hands. How many people in here, in their organizations, has an asset inventory today? See, in a perfect world, that would have been every single hand shot up. Every organization I worked at in the past, I would walk in and I would say, okay, what's our asset inventory? And every single time I would get a glazed expression. But how do you protect what you don't if you don't know what you have? So once you have the assets, you have the physical assets that you're trying to protect, you want to make sure you're confirming the user identities of the people that are accessing those devices. You want to see what they're doing on those devices. You want to ensure device security. So if you're having those devices access your network, you want to make sure that they're patched to current or N-1. You want to enforce contextual access policies because there's no reason that the VP of whatever has access to lolcats or any sort of weird little thing there and nobody else does. Like, what is the business rationale? And you want to secure access to all applications. So years ago, I was working at a financial institution, and people were spinning up cloud instances on AWS with a credit card. There was no centralized management. There was no way to control it. The only way we were able to actually find out who was doing what is we did an inventory of all the credit card receipts that were processed for expenses. And that's how we were able to figure out who was doing what. It was a bit of a ham-fisted way of doing it, but it worked. And across all these jobs that I've had over the years, one of the things that I learned is very, very, very salient discussion point is that castles simply don't scale. We tend to always look back to the old way of doing things of, we have a firewall, everything's fine. It really isn't. You don't want to trust something simply because it's inside your firewall. I worked in one organization where you could actually pivot for any part of the organization. I could sit at my desk. I could query the mainframe directly. I could do things on it. In one particular instance, I was doing exactly that. Problem was I started to feel guilty because I was afraid that I might have caused some trouble because it was a production system. So I got up from my desk and I'm like, all right, I'm going to face the music. I walked down to the security operations center and I told them what I had been doing, and I said, this is my IP address, this is this, that. And they said, oh, you were doing it where? They had no logging, no monitoring. They had absolutely no idea that some schmuck sitting in his desk was able to query the mainframe, which was the source of truth for the organization, and be able to cause any sort of trouble. This was really concerning. We want to make sure that we are going beyond that, in that we are making sure we are having security in a far more in-depth approach. And we want to make sure that we're breaking our old practices. Everybody likes to be environmentally friendly these days. And I wholeheartedly agree with that, with one exception. Don't recycle your passwords. One of the problems that I've noticed over the years as data breaches tend to get bigger and bigger is that users will use the same username and password for their Amazon account that they will use for the email, that they'll use for their online banking. And if an attacker gets one of them from a data breach, then they can replay them against other sites and potentially gain access to things you really don't want them to do. Because a password has very limited ability to do things. So if you show up at the castle walls and say, let me in, here's the password, it doesn't tell the person who's checking that password or the system that's checking that password, you are who you are. It just says that you have that key to get in. Ideally, you'll be told to go away, but reality is not so great. Now, before I ever got into computer security in any sort of fashion, or InfoSec for that matter, I was actually doing a degree in classical studies and archaeology. And one of the lessons I learned from there, I actually find highly applicable today. So back in 410 AD, the Visigoths, which were tribes in Europe, set up camp around the city of Rome and waited. They waited until they ran out of food, they ran out of supplies, and the Romans opened the gates and let them in. They used the Roman security paradigm against them. They showed demonstrably back in 410 AD that this sort of security model didn't work. So why do we rely on it today? This is something that we can do a far better job of, because there's always some threat that's going to pop up. And living in Canada, we have lots of bears, so we like to actually go, if you're trying to get out of trouble, you want to make sure you're faster than the hiker behind you. But these days, there's enough bears to go around. Right, Tavarish? So you want to look at things when you're talking about zero trust. You want to look at it and the approach of reducing risk. Oops, sorry, get out of your camera shot there. You want to make sure you're reducing risk. This is what it all boils down to. You want to look at the threats, the vulnerability, the impact, that gets to the risk. So you want to look at the steps in order to get to that point. I'll just wait till you're good? Okay. Because there are security types that really shouldn't have jobs. And this is going back to very early in my career. There was a gentleman who I referred to as the flaming sword of justice, because his entire raison d'etre was to literally fire anybody who had any sort of security transgression whatsoever. This is not a good way to be, nor does it enable the business in any way, shape, or form. It literally had the business saying security is a roadblock. And they were right. So as we go through and we mature as an industry, we have to understand that security has to be an enabler. It has to increase the value to the business so they can do things faster, safer, and securely. Otherwise, things like this are going to keep happening. Data breaches. So here's another question for you. How many people here are familiar with Amazon S3 buckets, by show of hands? Cool. Well, if you don't know, it's a good thing to read up on. So these are repositories that you can spin up on Amazon that by default are not publicly accessible. Let me say that again. By default are not publicly accessible. Now, I have this really weird habit of reading up on data breaches, and this goes back years. One of the things I have noticed of late is a lot of these security data breaches that we were seeing in the news, they'll say, oh, we had our S3 bucket was publicly accessible. So who's the fault in this case? Is it the user? Categorically, no. It is the security team for not taking the time to educate them as to why this is a problem. Because if we don't take that to the wider audience and try to shame them, again, we're back to the flaming sword of justice. This is not going to help further the narrative. Because most times these S3 buckets are being spun up by people that have no security background whatsoever. And these data breaches will keep coming. These are not S3 related, but for example, there was Marriott. Then we saw Quora. And very recently, we saw Citrix. Now, this was a company, and this is not to shame any of these companies. This is just to show you this could happen to anyone, anytime. In this particular case, this is a company that 98% of the Fortune 500 use. And not to beat up on them, but this is something that, as the end user, as the company, was there a risk assessment as to what could potentially happen if something like this went wrong? And it's not just about them, all the vendors that you use. This is something you need to look at. And data breaches, they can happen anywhere. So if you look, so the Verizon DBIR and IDC research report, this was two of the credentials that we saw here. 81% of data breaches involve weak credentials. So password 123. Or compromised devices. So if you leave your phone in the back of a taxi and then suddenly they have access to your system because it wasn't password protected, this is something you have to consider. Pardon me. Because that was a neat effect. Because the perimeter is exactly that. It is porous. There is all sorts of different ways into your environment. And these days the idea is the castle wall is gone. We have moved into various cloud environments, AWS, Azure, Google Cloud, all these different things, and you have to figure out how to manage access. And the idea of the perimeter is, sorry, did you want me to go back for that one? You look distraught. I'll come back. There you go. There you go. And incidentally, all these slides will be made available. And the idea of the perimeter is something that is maturing. And the access decisions is the key piece of the puzzle. And Wendy Nather, my boss, said it perfectly. The perimeter is anywhere the access decision is being made. Let that sink in for a second. The idea of the firewall, we're okay, is gone. The new perimeter is everything and everyone. In one particular organization I was working at, we had a 300 different external vendors that were attached to our network. Of those 300 vendors, half of them had any sort of documentation surrounding them. Of that half, 68, I think it was, had good documentation in that there was the company name on them and where they were coming from. This was a real problem because this ultimately led to a data breach because of a weak password for a company that was connected to us that we didn't actually have documented. So when you're looking at zero trust, you want to focus on the access, the applications, the trusted users, and the trusted devices. You need to manage this in a way that makes sense to your organization. So with our company, we have the Beyond model where that you can look at if you're working from a Starbucks or you're working from a Juan Valdez, obviously. These are the places where you're accessing your email. You're using RDP, SSH. You want to make sure that the person at the next table can't do exactly the same thing by virtue of the fact they're on the same network. You want to make sure you're not using static passwords and having secured connections, because the data breaches are going to keep coming. You going to take it? Go for it. There's one person back there that looks very unhappy with me when I'm about to click. So this is something from a site that I run, liquidmatrix.org, which has actually been online now for, oh Lord, 21 years. So this is my own personal site where I started tracking vulnerabilities, data breaches. This is back in 2012. And if you look here, let me see if this laser works. Yes. So here, the biggest one was LinkedIn with 6.5 million records. Now we're talking about data breaches in the order of magnitude of billions of records. There has to be a better way to approach this. And I know what I'm talking about because I've suffered my own data breach. This is from a company that I was working at years ago, and one morning I got a phone call, and it was from CBC, which is a Canadian news publication, followed by the Globe and Mail, which is another Canadian news broad, and so forth. My phone wouldn't stop ringing because a site that was online that our team was supposed to have taken offline 2 weeks previous was compromised by a group calling themselves Root Beer Security. I was less than happy. This was a traumatizing event. Thankfully, there was no real damage done. There were 192 accounts on this system. Thankfully, none of them mapped into our network. But the damage was already done. From a credibility perspective in the external world, this was a real and present problem. But we got lucky. Not everybody is quite so lucky. So if we look at this particular site here, this is from a site called informationisbeautiful.net, where they do data visualizations for different types of data sets. In this particular case, they were doing for vulnerabilities. And this is 2 years ago. Now, this next slide is virtually the same as now, but it's a little bit dated, but it's roughly the same thing. This is recently. So I'm going to go back 2 years ago, now. And this is not to shame any of these companies. This is to point out the fact that we need to do things better. Because as these data breaches happen, we have to realize that nowadays there's an impact to these. Now, I did some research and I came up with this. Is this still a valid law? I wasn't able to determine that, and I'm seeing some yeses. So this is the data breach notification law here in Colombia, and there are financial penalties associated with this if there is a data breach. Upwards of $600,000 US, or roughly 2 billion Colombian pesos. There's some real motivation to get things in order, because breaches are going to happen, but you want to make sure that we're not panicking about it. We're not going, oh dear. Like, for example, we saw a tool in the previous talk called Mudliska? Anyway, the tool that he was using to proxy to steal credentials for using two-factor authentication. The part that wasn't pointed out is you have to have lots of pieces in place for that actually to work. A valid certificate, access to the network, and things to that effect. So that tool, while it looked really cool, is not actually a clear and present danger to enterprises yet, but something to be prepared for. So one of the things I like to do is go through and look at a lot of different types of research. Now, we saw the one particular site that was talking about data that pertaining to SCADA systems, which is a very cool resource. There's also another resource out there is called Showdown. How many people here are familiar with that resource? Cool. If you're not, go check it out. Showdown.io is a really interesting resource. It's sort of like Google for hackers. So I said, okay, what's open in Colombia? This is how many ports are currently open in Colombia. Now, this is not a bad thing. These ports need to be online in order to have traffic, in order to access, but you have to understand that a subset of them will be problematic, will be presenting an opportunity to an attacker. Then in Bogota, this is how many ports are open. And it's really interesting. People are like, yeah, so what? A subset of those will be a problem. Example, somebody might have a camera in their warehouse that is publicly available. That was a fun one. I didn't have to do anything to access this. This was already archived in Showdown. So we have to look at how do we do these things better. Zero trust is a great way to approach this. We want to look at devaluing stolen credentials. So when an attacker breaches a site and dumps all these credentials and then uses them against other sites, you want to take that away from them, in that if you're looking at multi-factor authentication, you are removing that as a valuable asset to the attacker. You want to make sure that you're patching your systems to N-1, or to current or N-1, sorry. And yes, that is not as easy as it sounds. There is this wonderful, and I say that very, very sarcastically, wonderful movement of people saying just patch it. And if anybody has ever worked in a security enterprise, they know as a defender, that is not quite that simple. But it is achievable if we have the proper processes in place. You want to complicate lateral movement throughout your organization because if an attacker can breach one box, they're going to hop to the next and hop to the next. And they'll keep going until you can stop them. So why make it easier for them? Oh yes, prefer to call it trusted access as opposed to zero trust, but that's just me. So, remember when I was talking about, we were having these conversations back before the deperimeterization talk from Jericho Forum. I was working in one particular company where we had all these sort of issues, and I said, why don't we just make Bastion hosts out of all the laptops, desktops, servers, and just be done with it, get rid of the DMZ for my American friends, and just remove that from the mix. Thankfully, my sneakers didn't fail me, and I was able to escape that meeting with my life because the team that would have had to support it were very, very unhappy with me. And yet, here we are years later having the conversation. Because we need to move away from having the Tootsie Pop type of approach, where you have the hard outer shell being the firewalls, the DMZ, and the inner squishy center being the production servers that somebody thought was a good idea to load up an entire install of Microsoft Office for some bizarre reason. Now, when you're looking at having any sort of conversation in zero trust, you want to make sure that you're setting your expectations. You don't want to say, okay, I'm going to be zero trust compliant, not a thing. I'm going to have my zero trust certification by next March, not a thing. You want to make sure that you're aspiring to this as a goal. You have to go through it in an incremental fashion. But you want to make sure that you're setting goals that are achievable. You want to aspire to that because if you try to think of it as a one and done, a Ron Popeil, set it and forget it, you're never going to get there. Sorry, Dave. He was drinking water at that point. It's a game of increments. And one of the very key pieces of the puzzle is every time you achieve something, whether it's an asset inventory or a full review of all the users in your environment, you want to celebrate that. You want to make sure that you have positive reinforcement within your own organization. Because we have this wonderful bad habit, I say that incredibly sarcastically, we have this wonderful bad habit of celebrating the losses, or mourning the losses, as opposed to looking at the wins. Now, in addition to setting your expectations, you want to determine what your priorities are. What are the risks to your particular environment? Are you making teddy bears, or are you refining uranium? You got to look at these different types of things and say, how is this going to be applicable to me, and where is the pain going to hit me most? And you need to determine that priority set. So, imagine this. You have a list of credentials that are legitimate, that have been compromised, that are available on the internet, but you don't know about it yet. How do you stop them? Let that sink in for a second. This is one of those things where a multi-factor type approach, or even biometrics, will help alleviate this situation. Will it get rid of it entirely? No. Security is never 100%. It's a game of increments, and you got to keep fighting. When you're looking at zero trust, you want to look at verifying your users, your devices, and protecting the applications. I mentioned that before. I'm a big fan of repetition. There, I see the cameras going up. One particular example, I was working at a company probably, just over 10 years ago, where we did an assessment of all the user accounts in our environment. And we found roughly about 50 accounts that had administrative level access to the systems. And of those, about 10 to 15 of them were no longer with the company, and one in particular had root access on everything in the entire corporation. This is a multinational, and he had been deceased for 10 years. Somebody had used his account 7 years earlier. These are the kind of things that we have to make sure that you got to do like a staff add remove process. You want to make sure that your processes are in place to do a better job. Because if you don't have that groundwork, if you don't have that homework done, you're going to be really chasing to catch up. So for example, with our type of thing, we have the user tries to log in from their device. The device is checked in the device inventory. It checks against the source of truth, in this case, Active Directory, goes through and Duo says, oh yeah, you can access these particular sites. And that is totally customizable depending on what your environment is. The trusted users is the key piece of the puzzle of the three, or one of the three key pieces of the puzzle. You want to make sure that you are having users access your systems that are supposed to be there, that need to be there. Okay, camera went down. Stolen credentials. If an attacker has your username and your password, they won't have the second factor authentication if you're doing multi-factor authentication. Now, I'm not at any point going to advocate on SMS because that is a problem. As we saw with the tool, that is a problem where it can be intercepted. There are other types of technology, like push technology, that can help alleviate that, and trusted device. So the attacker now has to have much more information than they previously did. They need the device, the second factor, the username. Username password is generally the easy thing to do. But trusted devices, you want to make sure that the devices that you're accessing your environment are patched to current or N-1. Again, there's the repetition. Because if they don't have that sort of level of security, they can be introducing new vulnerabilities into your environment that you had not foreseen. The law of unintended consequences. Here's a great example. So this type of thing has actually bitten me before because I travel a lot and I had not updated my browser. And this particular case, this is not for mine, but this is a great example where the Duo app was saying, look, you got to patch before we can gain access to the network. And this is a good thing because I had neglected to patch to current. And unfortunately, it bit me in the backside. Devices with poor hygiene is a real problem. If you're introducing vulnerabilities, if you have Flash on your system that hasn't been updated in 2 years, that's a real issue because the attacker might know that because you've gone to a website that has inventoried what's on in your browser, which can easily happen. And these are why it is good to keep patched. And you want to have an inventory of all the applications that you're using in your day-to-day lives. If you're using Outlook Web Access, Office 365 or Gmail or whatever it happens to be, you want to be able to marshal your users so they're accessed because there was a time where that wasn't even an option. You could only handle the things that were inside, these devices that were on-prem. And you want to be able to get granular so you can lock it right down. And Beyond Corp, as Google put it out, the whole idea there, and very much in the similar time of our look at it, or our perspective here, is you want to make sure that you are leveraging the stuff that you already have. Again, like I said, when I started in this field 25 years ago, a lot of what Zero Trust has today is stuff that we should have been doing fundamentally back then. So, the Zero Trust shopping list, or better yet, trusted access shopping list. First off, you want to create an asset inventory in your environment. I can't hammer away on that one enough. You want to look at your user management. How are you doing it? I was telling Dave actually earlier, I was giving a talk in Las Vegas about 2 years ago, and I was standing in line to get a coffee roughly 10 minutes before my talk, and there were 2 people standing in line ahead of me who were talking about how they had a file called passwords.txt that was on a shared open directory in their environment where anybody could gain access to those passwords and use them for any of the systems in the network. Oddly enough, those 2 people were in my talk later, and I brought it up, and they left promptly, but that's just it. You want to make sure you have solid user management. You shouldn't just have shared passwords in a text file as one particular example. Defined repeatable processes is something I love to beat up on in a good way. This is something where you can do yourself a world of good. If you have a process in your environment that you can repeat on a continuous basis and refine, this can help reduce your rates of incidents internally to your own organization, and you don't need any vendor to teach you that. You can do this yourselves. And making sure that you have a patch management process, log management, any of these things, constantly revisit them and make sure they're up to date. And once you have these different pieces in place, you can start looking at user and entity behavior, so you can see what kind of anomalous detections you're catching as a result of all of this information that you're now harvesting. And my favorite here, going back to my conversation earlier about being able to talk to the mainframe without any sort of controls in place, network zone segmentation. There is no reason that your back office folks who are working on spreadsheets and all the rest of it can access your switches and your routers. Or in one particular organization I was working at, we were a global footprint. We had MPLS circuits around the planet. I could literally sit at my desk in Toronto and query devices in Malaysia, and nobody knew I was doing it. These are things that you can look at. So, once you get away from those core fundamentals in that you've established them, then the attackers are going to say, okay, you've made it hard for me to get usernames and passwords. You've added multi-factor authentication, all these other pieces as part of your zero trust journey. Now they're going to start targeting the authentications for your APIs. That's just one example of many. They're going to start looking at the services that you have freely available that people can connect to from the outside world. Now, supply chain is a really interesting thing. This is a submarine map of cables that are laid under the oceans, and this is just an example. I gave my first talk on supply chain security back in 2013, and this is just an example of all the different elements you have to consider. So when you're having an application that is being built, if you have outsourced developers as an example, are you verifying the code that they're delivering to you? Sure, it works, but is there anything else in the code that was introduced accidentally? Great example is the OpenSSL library. There was possibly an accidental inclusion there that caused some serious problems. But this is one of those things. When you're looking at it in your environment, think of all the vendors you're working with. Think of all the customers you're working with. Think of all the people that are internal to your own environment and all these different elements. And security footprint has really gone beyond that. So when I was talking about earlier with the partner pen test, this was a great example. I had the pen test team start at 9 o'clock in the morning. They phoned up and I answered the phone. I said, great, let's get this going. And they said, all right, we're on. Put the phone down, got my coffee and my newspaper, and I sat there and I was reading. 9:14, my phone rang. They had already gained access to the entire network. They had the entire Active Directory structure. They had every switch and router in the environment. Why? Because one of the vendors that was attached to our network, one of the third parties that we quote-unquote trusted, was using a default username and password on their access device that the pen test team was able to grab that, go in, and once they were in, there was no network end segmentation. They were able to traverse the entire network. These are the things you got to think about. Where are they going to come from? Because they're going to keep coming. An example, you know how I was talking about all the different ports, the 300,000 plus ports that are available in Bogota as an example. Of that, there's a subset of SSH daemons that are excuse me, publicly available. Pardon me. So this is just one example from the list that I pulled out. And then I went, okay, how many vulnerabilities does this particular version of OpenSSH have? Oh, just a few. This is one that's live and talking today. So in Colombia, this is how many SSH daemons are currently listening. So a subset of those are susceptible to issues. This is one of those things where we have to constantly be working on these things to do a better job. Because, yes, this is not the sexy part of security, but this is essential. We have to make sure that we're addressing these things, otherwise the attackers are going to have your lunch for you. Now, I put this in specifically because Chad was making fun of encrypting everything. Or no, actually it was Dave was talking about encryption, yes. Because, yes, encrypt your data at rest, encrypt your data in flight, but he made an incredible point yesterday that I have to hammer away at, is when the data is being processed in your applications, it is not encrypted. So you want to make sure that you are having controls in place to compensate for that, to make sure that users can't just simply grab that data and do malicious things with it. And these days, encryption is a whole lot easier than you might imagine. There are better ways to do things. Yes, that's a little vendory, I admit, but I'll just skip to that. So this is a great example. So W3C came out with a new standard called WebAuthn. If you are, actually, here's a question. How many people here are familiar with WebAuthn? Whoa. All right, you have a homework assignment. Go look up this. Just search for this in Google or whatever your favorite browser is, or sorry, search engine is. Is there any others left? This is an open standard to allow for passwordless authentication to websites. This is the new hotness. This was ratified a week ago. So this is a real thing now. I really recommend you look at this because this is the next best thing. So if you're going to log into, say, your internet banking, it'll send you a push because it's integrated into the website to whatever your mobile device is using for your authentication, and you can do it that way. So allow me to sum up. So with zero trust, there are some absolutes that we have to understand. Everything is hostile. You need to build and establish a trust engine and reduce your threat surface. We don't need to make it any easier for the attackers than necessary. If you've read any of the post-mortem of the Equifax, or just talk to Adrian about it, oh, he snuck away, there were so many things there that were wrong that didn't have to be that way. And you don't want to have that in your own environment as well. And you want to keep it as simple as possible while being effective. So, let's fix that. There we go. Trusted access. Again, wonderful thing about repetition. You want to build your asset inventory, user management. You want to know what's on your network. So this is one of those great things. I had a conversation in one company roughly about 12 years ago. I asked them how many Windows servers were on the network. They said, I don't know. I said, how many Unix systems are on here? I don't know. This was the chief information security officer for this particular organization. Then I asked the same question to the CIO and his management team. They couldn't answer that question either. It shouldn't be that way. Defined repeatable process is something that you are going to get a lot of value from in your own organization. One power company I worked for years ago, the CIO actually took the very bold step of saying, for the next year, there's going to be no new projects at all. We're just going to do maintain, and we're going to implement ITIL. How painful is that at the thought of it? But it worked. We did ITIL, well, ITIL Lite, but we were able to do a measurement of rates of incidents pre and post ITIL implementation. Our rate of incidents dropped 72% in that particular organization. And this is something that you guys can do as well. And right down to the bottom one, this is one of my favorites that I never get tired of saying, network zone segmentation. There is no reason that you should have access to stuff that you don't need to have access to. Now, passwords, we like to make fun of them. Now, this particular thing, and of course I've now blanked on what CTSS stands for, but this was an MIT system. It was computing time shared systems. Anyway, suffice to say, this was an access management to allow MIT students to use their high-end computing systems to do their testing. Unfortunately, the students were only allowed 4 hours per week to access these systems, which was not enough time for them. So they rapidly figured out how to extract the password file and leverage their attacks so they could get more time. And this is actually where the idea of the password file ostensibly came from, and this was back in 1961. They are still sorry about this, because now we're looking at using static passwords, and this is not something that we can maintain over time. And especially the one thing that drives me absolutely bonkers is when we shame users. This is not going to help your narrative. This is not going to improve things. You need to train your users. Incidentally, we have somebody over here that can help you with that. Hi, Chad. But this is the reality of it is this password came into being to help regulate users' access to a system, and unfortunately, this permeated all across the board. IBM had a similar system come out in roughly about 1961-62. Even they said they weren't sure if they were out before this particular MIT system, but this is an example of this was just something they slapped on, and unfortunately, it took off. Old security practices, the way we used to do things, the shaming the users, all of that has to go away. And as we are evolving as security professionals, we understand that the flaming sword of justice is dissolving. It is falling by the wayside, and that we can do a far better job of these things. There's no need for us to throw the holy hand grenade of Antioch every time something goes wrong. We can do better. I would like to thank you all for your time today. I really enjoyed having the opportunity to speak here. Thank you to Ed, thank you to Tactical Edge, and especially thank you to you. And if you have any questions, this is where you can find me.